I originally am from Uruguay. If you don't know where it is, you're welcome to say, where is that? That's what I get most of the time. Well, sometimes I get, what is that? So if you say, where is that, you're already high in my ranking, right? Who knows where Uruguay is here? I know a few of you do know.
I'm from there.
Oh, I can't believe it. That doesn't happen every day.
I know.
There's two Uruguayans in the room. That's amazing. We're 3 million barely, and maybe 3.5 million around the world, 3 million in the country. And so I'm going to be drawing a lot from my own research and experience from Uruguay. And I also have worked in Latin American cases broadly, particularly in the Southern Conos, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, and I know a little bit of Mexican cases. But you'll see, I'm just going to speak to my forte, which is what I've done. And I trust that a lot of you here may have a lot of expertise on also other cultures within Latin America, right? This is, I'm going to be reading a few excerpts from my book. So I am not necessarily wanting to put the emphasis on trauma. I actually loved what Asada did today. I don't know if, were all of you in Asada's sort of a performance, how can you call that, a beautiful address? Well, for those of you who weren't there, I'll repeat a few of the things that resonated with me. We do talk about trauma, and I have definitions actually there. So you have the handbook, the handout, sorry, not the handbook. There's a handout here also if you want to circulate. If you don't get one and you want one, you're welcome to, I'll circulate a piece of paper for you to put your email. I am very happy. Todd, would you put a list here, like emails? And so I'm very happy to share materials with you if you email me, if I didn't have enough papers. Please, there's 2 more chairs here if you want to join. Yeah, these are just for people to circulate. All right, so as I said, I'm trying to do 2 things here. I am defining trauma. I have all the necessary academic PowerPoints there with a lot of steps and things because I want you to take something from me. I want to give you something. But my main goal is that we get to a moment where we can maybe, if we don't have time for everyone to share in, those of you who feel empowered to speak up and share some of your healing practices. That's what I'd love this to become at some point a conversation, right? So I'm gonna give you my story a little bit. I'm hoping it will take about 30 minutes. I've been known to go way over my time, so I hope that, where's Sante? They're here. If you can remind me to stop around 20 to 25 minutes, and maybe I'll take 30. But after that, I think we're all oversaturated with information. And what I want to do here is have a conversation. And the colorful papers here are for you to, of course, do whatever you can with them. You can write notes in them, but you can, if you get bored, you can, doodle or draw. And I'm not trying to get to a deep point where we all remember our personal traumas or our collective traumas or our historical traumas. That's not what we're trying to do here. But it can happen because we might get into examples and you might resonate with some of them. You can also turn it into a little handbook, the way that Ruth does at ECHO, which is fascinating. My daughter and me have been doing it since she was little. So you can, every few minutes, I'm hoping to stop and take a check with you. You might want to write on your own personal handbook, and you can take it with you. And I would also love if you share it with me. So we'll see how we do that. I may take a picture of it, or you can leave it with me and your address, and I can mail it back to you, or something like that. So I want to build a sort of a forum of expertise of what do we do, what do communities do after trauma. That's kind of the leading. So let me see if this works. I have a pretty horrifying image, right? Even though for me it's inspiring. This comes from Montevideo, Uruguay, my hometown. This image that is made by an artist called Pilar Gonzalez took about 35 years to be produced, and it's trying to represent, I don't know what you see in there, but trauma without words, that's probably the way it must look, right? Many, many cultures have ways of representing trauma in their culture, right? But I'm more interested in the ways in which these overwhelming experiences that we'll define in a minute, and you can make your own definition, it doesn't matter, the definition so much, the way that these experiences are so overwhelming that they might not find a representation in the culture for sometimes for hours or days or months, but sometimes for decades, right? So we've spent a day and a half already going through a lot of different experiences that we know is the representations of these experiences are, you have to dig for them, even though sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, as some of our speakers beautifully and very eloquently elaborated. Sometimes it's really hard to see. And some of these experiences, particularly talking now about Latin America, and particularly talking about the country where I'm from, Uruguay, they are very invisible. Actually, they're not invisible. They are invisibilized. They're made invisible. Obviously, they're not invisible for those who suffer them, right? So I just want to go back to this idea that Asara mentioned, is that it's not what we're not really working on trauma. Trauma is just a common name that a lot of our systems are using now to define, well, it's nice to know what we're talking about. Because if we don't define something, whatever way you want to define it, we cannot work on it. If we don't make something visible, then it will stay in silence. So that's why I called my talk Breaking the Silence, and I care a lot about sharing stories. Now, the little carrot for paper there is because sometimes we don't share narratively. In fact, a lot of the stories in this book are about mothers or parents or grandparents of people who disappeared in Uruguay, actually, not in Argentina or Chile, but Uruguay, and their children, the children they had under their care, and the conversations or the ways that they related or communicated in some way the experiences of a member of the family just vanishing and not having a narrative initially to talk about it. Of course, today we talk about it. You know, we have some books and some representations. We have Pilar González's representation of what it must feel inside to be in the isolation of having someone vanish in your family and not have any recourse and anywhere to go, right? So many of you might know the story of Mothers de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, because they're well known. There's representations about them, right? A lot of you might know the foulards, or some mothers, of course, in Central America, because there was a UN intervention, there was a peace process, it was very public. Not that they didn't go through silence before and after, but so there are moments in our continent where we have visualizations of this problem, but I'm drawing from a case where it took at least 35 years for the experience to start to be narrated. So what I'm saying is that we might narrate something in our fold up or in our notes, or we might draw something, or whatever you want to do. The narrative is probably one of the last ways that people actually communicate these kinds of stories. Sometimes they're just simply embodied, and you find them through the silences. The silences leave their marks. That's one of the ideas. So this is just the kinds of things you do in a PowerPoint. You define your goals. I'm not going to read it. I am assuming that you skimmed through that as I was talking. But the last point, especially, or the last 2 points, we're sharing stories of what we do after trauma, if there is an after trauma. Sometimes you're simply living and coping with whatever is ongoing. You might call it trauma, or you might not call it trauma, right? This is just the definition that I shared with you to convoke you here. But the main question for me is, what lessons do we learn from us, from individuals that I've met that I can share a bit with you, limited time, communities that you belong to as well, or that you service or you work with, and how have people actually survived? How do they repair? How do they build? And more particularly, how do they grow? What is the growth during and after trauma? Because, and this is not in my PowerPoint, but I want to share something with you, which is very interesting, and Asada reminded me as well. Call it trauma or call it effects of violence. Initially I didn't have the word trauma, so when I started this work, I just called it the effects of violence and impunity. The important thing is that most people actually recover. I don't know what that means for each person and each community, but people live on. They may live with it, They may go through it. Things do happen that are not always the healthiest, but only 15%, if I'm going to use the American language of psychiatry, PTSD is only developed by about 15% of the population. This is across cultures, right? And so my question was, well, what happens to the other 85% that continue to live? So they breathe, and they choose very specifically to not stop breathing, right? Number two, they love. They reach out to others. They engage. They develop new hope. They develop their own partnerships and families, and they actually, they lost a child, well, they have another child. I don't know how you find the courage to do that, but some people that are amazing do. If you've lost your child, maybe you look for them for 40 years, and some of the mothers that I'm going to talk about are still looking for their children. They're in their 80s and 90s now. In Uruguay, they are still looking for their loved ones who disappeared, right? They might have had a very rich life, right? So that's the kind of question. So I'm accepting, hopefully we'll have time to go around the room with some words of wisdom. If you have them already in your head, put them in that colorful paper. Put, one, maybe call them by a noun or a verb. What do you do with the loss and the effects of violence in your own life, in your community, et cetera, et cetera? So this is the plan I have, and I might skip a little bit because our time is sort of a little compressed, but I'm probably going to skip through the definitions pretty quickly. If any moment you want to interrupt and throw in a question or throw in an example or something that you don't agree with or you want to converse about, you're very welcome. You don't have to respect my order. At every step, I try to have a sharing activity, so maybe at least you'll get to talk to the people you're sitting next to each other and collect a few ideas as well. So by the end of the hour and a half, I hope, or now it's a little more like an hour and 10 minutes, that you will leave with some things. I think Asade and the speakers yesterday already named everything we can do possibly in a community, right? But what is interesting to me is, can we have a few specific ideas or specific stories that can inspire us? That's another thing. All right, so we're going to define moving from trauma to what is community and collective trauma, how we recognize it, if it's invisible and silent, how do we recognize it? And I know we have a very special audience that works in very different institutions with these issues. Of course, how to cope, that probably is the part that I can skip faster because psychology has already given us a lot of tools for coping, but mostly, as I said, I don't want to cope with trauma in terms of deficit model, but what are the kinds of practices that foster resilience? And actually, I don't want to stay in resilience. For me, resilience is the basic. Resilience, if you define resilience, right? Imagine a bamboo shoot. It's just having that flexibility that you're not broken, you come back where you were. That's still not a model of expanding life, right? Healing towards growth. So I want to move us towards thinking, what doesn't only just supports our healing and our resilience, but what actually pushes us to grow. In the movie we just saw, some of us probably just saw it, they talked a lot about lifelong learning. One of the things I would say about trauma is trauma can block learning in some ways, block curiosity, block the ability to integrate new things, right? So maybe one of the things I want to see people during and after trauma is do not lose the trust and the ability to open up to new things, learn, right? As simple as that. One of those words of wisdom could be that. So anyways, before I go into a few slides that I'm going to rummage through, I would like I was going to make a circle, but actually this is a very big circle. So if you could just turn to the two people next to you, left and right, and just exchange names. And maybe say to each other, one word that brought you here. And I'll try to overhear a couple so I get a sense of who you are and what you're doing. If I spend that whole circle, we'll spend all the time.
Mainly in the capacity
Okay, I'm going to stand here so you can see you. All right, well, thank you for that. If we went through the circle as I planned, we would spend the whole hour and a half just introducing ourselves, right? But at least you got a little glimpse of who's here, and I hope you'll share with me a little later. So, I think it's not a waste of time to remind ourselves, even though we have been in a safe space these last 2 days, right? That we are here to share. These are some of the things that I think we've all been saying in the different talks and in the different conversations, right? If you, for any reason, start having a hard time, the first thing to do, breathe. I actually have to remember that. Breathe. Breathing or changing the pace of your breathing can really calm you down, right? So we don't have a lot of help here if somebody really, really feeling, I can talk to you after the session, but I can't talk to you during. So breathe. Of course, when we're going to talk with each other, deep listening, this active listening, I think that we all excel at that, right? Just when you're listening to someone, you're just focusing on what the person is saying without judgment. Not worried about what we're going to respond to or how we are going to look so much better than them or so much more intelligent, but really taking in what that human being in front of you is trying to do. I think we've all been doing this throughout the conference, but just to make sure. Then all these things is things that I'm hoping that will happen here in the next hour, which is you have paper or your own paper, you can write. You can write for yourself, anything that resonates. You don't have to share it. It can be very intimate and you take it with you. If you want to share, maybe you can create one of those handbooks or a little paper and give it to me and then we'll have a conversation. We are here mainly to tell stories. That's what we're doing, right? And I think that is also a clue on what to do during and after trauma. Most of the people I met that are reflected in this book and other works I have, it took them at least 25 years to start talking and narrating their story. Not that they didn't know their story, their loved one also knew their stories. There was a lot of silence between people, right? So telling the story, as simple as it sounds, is definitely not simple, right? As we have heard from all the other speakers that we've been hearing from the different experiences in different cultures. Drawing, or of course representing something graphically, is actually sometimes more powerful even than the word. When you get to the word, you have to have had a long process. But representing something visually might be actually something that you can do quite immediately. And you don't have to guide it too much with your thought. You can just let your hand. Actually, I'm remembering the beautiful, what was the healing stones we did yesterday? Some of you were here. That was a beautiful example of that kind of experience. And of course, as I said, learning, we're here to learn. Nobody has the right answer necessarily. I don't claim to. I'm just sharing my stories with you. Of course, I don't know if we'll have time to get so confessional, but if we did, or anybody will share something heavy duty from their own lives, we would like to keep their confidentiality in this room, right? So that we all feel safe. You don't have to keep a confidentiality about what I say, because what I say is quite public, it's published. I teach regularly at Cal State LA, and I don't have any problem with sharing my own story. There definitely are private stories that I don't share every day, but they might come out or not. And then, of course, this whole thing about comfort zone. I do want you to stay in your comfort zone, because as I said, I don't have a host of therapists outside waiting for you, although maybe I'm sure I'm surrounded by therapists and educators, right? And community members. But sometimes if you feel safe, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone is not a bad idea, right? Because I feel that at the present moment, we live so much in our comfort zones that God forbid that we tread upon someone else's experience. And we seem to tend to keep comfortably with our own and not push ourselves to understand the other with large O, right? The other, that foreign, strange creature that is so different from us. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, and probably we don't have that problem. But in every day of your life, if we can push ourselves a little bit beyond our comfort zone, that's when you learn the most. if you think about it. If you're not, as my students, when I have them they have to do a micro teaching in my classes. They have to stand in front of the classroom, about 45 people, so it's kind of a group about this, and they have to teach their own lesson for about 15 minutes. Of course, their anxiety level is skyrocketing. That's very much out of their comfort zone. Just like the young men or teenagers that we just met before the movie, right? That is really, really nerve-wracking. But oh God, do you learn a lot, right? Let me stop there because I want to read something, and then I'm going to ask you to write something. But I'm going to read you something that took about 25 years, as I was saying, to be elaborated by author Carlos Lizcano, Uruguayan writer and former political prisoner. The whole book is about oblivion. I hope to let you be able to tell you what oblivion is, but like the word says, it's some kind of forgetting, right? So he talks about oblivion in this way, and it's a whole paragraph, so please bear with me. I'll try to read it a bit slowly. I wish I had printed it so you could read it. To reach the place where memories are, to see what they are like, and to put them into words, so as to create oblivion. Oblivion is not the lack of memory. It is the memories that went to their place, to the country of oblivion, now organized into words. The opposite of words is not silence. It's the void of words. Silence, what is not said, is also a form of remembering. I remember, but I do not tell myself. If I do not tell myself, it will be difficult to forget. The memories are in the body. The body chooses the words that will say what is remembered. What is not remembered will never be forgotten. Because it was not turned into words, something said or thought or written, it cannot be forgotten. I'll read that again. Because it was not turned into words, it cannot be forgotten. Then, one day, the unforgotten memory, not made into words, jumps from the body and becomes present. And it hurts once again like the first day. We remember so that it stops hurting. And that is a little more, but I'll stop there because we don't have a lot of time. If anybody wants a quote from that, I'm happy to send it. So now I wanted you to, there's a very short exercise. Many of you might know this exercise. It's effective. Just write the first thing that comes to mind. You don't even have to write 10 words, just the first 5 will do for the benefit of time. Things that you think of yourself when you want to define yourself. And I will not ask you to share it. So you might want to share it with the person that you just introduced yourself to, but you don't have to. So take like maybe 10 seconds to write 5 words about yourself. And again, it's like a brainstorming writing, right? So you're not thinking about it. And I'm just taking 5 seconds and I'm moving on. You can still be writing as I move on, right? So now we're going to go into maybe about 10 slides. I might skip some if you tell me also that it's not necessary. This almost a little bit of a recap of what we've been doing together. I see a typo already, classic definitions. That makes me nervous. Okay, so that makes me mad at myself. We've been all talking through the conference. I'm going to skip through the highlighted parts, right? That trauma is like a wound, right? It's not always a physical wound. It's more like an emotional wound. Actually, in the documentary we just saw, I loved one of the Native Americans saying, it's an emotional wound that repeats itself over and over and over, right? That's probably one of the best definitions I've ever heard. The other things that happen when we can talk about extreme violence that is ongoing and sort of it's not one necessarily discrete event that happens. It sounds like the whole conference has been about experiences that one basically lives through and is lucky to survive, right? And the people who do survive, which are all in this room and outside, they don't just survive because they're dragging themselves on the ground bleeding. They have full lives. This does contradict a lot of the academic literature that I've been trained with in all kinds of systems, that trauma is this thing where it really stops you. It is true. It stops you in many ways. It freezes you. But on the other hand, people learn. People learn how to do something. So that's what we need to get at. What is it that everyone is doing that are not completely, victims of PTSD necessarily? That's a category that I really don't like. So there is vulnerability, right? There is feelings of helplessness, right? We talk about a psychic wound, especially if we're practitioners or professionals. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. But I'm going to say that also affects the quality of our memories, right? So if we work with memory sounds like a more empathetic word than trauma, right? Trauma, I imagine people really devastated. Your memory is somewhat frozen in the past. In some way, you're trapped by your past, but it's not a genetic condemnation. You don't have to be stuck in your past. There are plenty of tools where you can personally do it or help someone move through time. That's basically a summary of what we're doing here. How people move through time to break that silence that trauma somehow imposed, and to move through time in a way that they can maybe tell themselves their story. Once you tell it to yourself, obviously, you may be more ready to share it. And if you can share it, then you've made it visible. And it's about the moving from the invisibility to the visibility. Does that make sense? Yes. Did you? Oh, okay. Oh, okay, sorry, I thought you had a question. So we all understand, the easiest way to do it is traumatic experience is a way to call something that happens after tremendous violence. Be it political violence, socioeconomic violence, cultural violence, physical or emotional violence. Sometimes it's a combination of all that. Sometimes it's just a discrete moment, or sometimes it's a whole culture across generations, right? As we've talked about, the experience of African Americans, the experience of Jews, the experience of Native Americans, the experiences. I was thinking today, as Asada was talking about the experience of black children. Well, Rwandans in the genocide, Sudan. There's just so many. We talk about the Armenian and the Jewish genocides as the blueprints of the 20th century, but we really are moving on ongoing policies. I think that a lot of times it's policies, human-made policies, that create this cauldron that creates trauma. So as I said, I don't have a problem calling it trauma, but we have to be aware of the structural and very perfectly avoidable circumstances that lead to this violence, that then we're trying to respond as trauma, right? So again, it's an overwhelming emotion that individuals cannot, at least initially, integrate, right? And so obviously we all know these responses psychologically. The first stage usually is avoidance, silence. One would rather forget these things than spend your Thursday in different ways than looking at all these dreadful events, right? But somehow I go back to the words of Liscana, right? It's something that you'd rather forget, but you cannot forget. And when I say you, I may mean an individual, I may mean a family, I may mean a group, may mean a whole nation. And it sounds like today we could even talk about global trauma. Some people do talk about that. The important thing I want to underline also, many of you already know this, that trauma cannot really be defined, and it's not easy to diagnose because it depends on the subjective experience of the bearer of the experience, right? And so I asked you to write those words. If you ask me what I would write, most of the things I would write about myself involve someone else. Do you find that with your own definitions? If you look back at your list about yourself, no matter what you write, I challenge you to tell me one thing you wrote about yourself that does not involve another human being. Like if I say mother, it already involves my daughter, right? If I say, I don't know, Teacher, of course, it involves my students. If I say exile, which was my experience, to share with my colleague here from Uruguay, I was a child of exiles. It involves being displaced from my land at a very young age, right? At that time, it wasn't a trauma. We're just moving because my dad got a new job, something like that. That was the official version, right? It was not trauma. We're just moving, right? So again, it very much depends on the story that you tell yourself and the story that the community tells around you and the larger story that the whole culture tells about the experience, right? But we all know violence. All human beings know violence where they see it. Call it whatever you want, right? So again, trauma becomes trauma through a process, right? You can't say, oh, you are traumatized. I can't tell you that, right? You're the only person who can say, I think I've experienced this extreme violence in whatever shape that we, can imagine, and I need to reach out for help, right? The other thing is, more often than not, is the people who have gone through this subjective experience that educate the others. And it's their own so-called victims that telling their stories, make themselves visible, and find repair mechanisms. So we're actually learning from them, right? This book about state terrorism and the politics of memory in Latin America is full of stories of people who suffer disappearance, political prison, and exile in the context of political violence. I'm learning from them, even though I was a child of some of them, one of those families, right? So that's kind of the irony in a way, right? Professionals and educators and people who come into systems to try to reach out to and do something with this, because we are human beings that want to do something about it. We have to share wisdom, right? And that's why I think that we can become communities of learners trying to share, right? So I probably can skip through these very quickly because we've already gone through this in the conference, right? It's a state of shock. We've moved in the literature and in the knowledge in the world from understanding psychological trauma to being a little more aware that most of the time psychological trauma in an individual comes wrapped in community and collective trauma. So we need to probably stop a minute when I get to those definitions. How is that different? It's important then to understand the origins of a process, how it develops, and its impact, right? Again, that's the story. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, or sometimes an ongoing situation, right? It's important to know that we have coping and healing strategies. It's not a condemnation. It's not a fate. You're traumatized and that's it for you, right? It has, as I said, timing is very important, the time of life and the time that people go through. Some people are able to move through time fairly quickly. When I say quickly, maybe 20 years. And other people, maybe in their 70s, having suffered an experience in their childhood and they still haven't moved one single day. And as Liscano said, when they remember, it hurts as the first day. Doesn't matter if 30 years went by, 50 years, or 100 years, right? So that's really interesting. And there may be no visible signs, right? So this kind of recaps something I just said about the timing and the long-term exposure. The collective trauma, as different from psychological trauma, right, is that it is culturally communicated, right, and also transmitted to the next generation. Although put a pause there, because transmitted to the next generation doesn't mean harming the next generation. Trauma can harm people, but depending on what is transmitted, it can actually empower people, as we just seen in many of the examples in the morning. Right? So even there's no visible signs, there are representations, there are emotions, there are stories, if we're lucky to have stories at some point. Right? Usually the first decade or the first 5 to 10 years after a very massive cultural or historical trauma, there's a lot of silencing and denial because people cannot articulate even personally, what they've experienced. And even worse, the timing gets longer if the culture surrounding the experience is in denial. Okay, so one question that a lot of audiences ask is, can collectives suffer trauma just as individuals suffer trauma, right? I mean, we all know that that's true. The problem and the challenge is how to see it and how to assess the social impact, or even the impact in the community, and of course the impact on individuals and relationships. So one of the things is that, if you look at the third point, is that what makes it a situation most traumatic to human beings is when it's mostly the result of human action or inaction. So for example, a natural disaster, that can be very traumatic. Think of the tsunami in Japan, or I don't know, earthquakes here in California repeatedly, or a large earthquake in Mexico City a few years ago, right? Those are traumatic. But most of the time, if you start analyzing, like sociologists have analyzed some natural disasters, the problem is not just what happened in the event itself. That would be one discrete event. The problem is what came after the disaster, right? Usually that's political, policy making, or policy inaction. And so most of the time after disasters, people lose their communities, right? Think about New Orleans after Katrina, or more recently New York, or so the problem is not just natural, but it's conflated with human action or human inaction, right? So sometimes what happens is not so traumatic, but what comes after the very hardship experience is traumatic because of the lack of response, or the denial, or the lack of resources, physical, spiritual, psychological, and actual social, economic, and political, right? So that is why we cannot define it a priority, even though this is very general, right? We need to go, each of us need to be thinking now on what are the kinds of experiences we have been exposed to, we have learned through our, the people that we work with. How are these experiences actually experienced and communicated in some way in cultural specific ways? So let me give you and then of course the point I was making with the list you made is that everything you do is not just individual. We live in such an individualistic culture, right, in America. Everything we do is what I call intersubjective. Maybe write that word. If you want to write one word about this workshop, it's everything is intersubjective, which means that we don't have to believe this idea that we are an isolated individual. That's what trauma does to you. It makes you feel isolated and frozen in time in a past from which you will never recover. Actually, I just told you 85% at least of people do in some way recover. There are, of course, signs in their soul, and you carry the experience. There's no way you're going to forget it. But you learn through the experience, and sometimes you even thrive. I'll give you an example of cultural specific. The first time I approached a mother of a disappeared child, this child was maybe 19 or 20. When we think of the disappeared in Latin America, we imagine a lot of Che Guevaras with a lot of beard and curls, but these people were teens or very young adults, most of them, that just dare to dream a future of solidarity amongst people, right or wrong, or they all had different political ideologies. Actually, one of those people who could have disappeared and was politically apprehended and was a political prisoner for a long time became our president, and some of you may have heard of Uruguayan President Pepe Mujica, the poorest president in the world, who has like all these interesting Charles Chaplin kind of shoes. Well, what I'm saying is that when I first approached the mothers of these barely young adults or teenagers that had been taken away by the state in the 70s, right? This is one mother, I'll call her Luisa. Luisa is an amazing woman. She's in her 90s now. She's still alive. I said, Luisa, what happened to you? And she said, oh, no, mija, nothing happened to me. Everything that happened to my son. So in her mind, this was in the 90s. So she'd been living with this experience of not finding her son for 20 years. In Uruguay, we were still surrounded by silence because in Uruguay, people voted to not have any kind of truth-telling program or judiciary process for the perpetrator. So basically, this was a society that until today, pretty much, perpetrators and victims and their families and the public at large live together. And it's a very small society, so everybody knows each other. And so when I asked her, tell me about your experience, it must have been difficult. She's like, oh, it didn't happen to me, it happened to my son. And I was like, that's strange, I don't understand that. I did not find someone that felt like a victim, right? I found someone that was just looking for her son and had gathered with other mothers and other relatives looking, and of course, as you know, it became a very famous movement. In Argentina, it became a very famous movement. In Uruguay, it did not become a very famous movement because there was so much silence, right? Then I go to the children of these people who had disappeared, because some of them had actually married really young, and their spouses actually, some of them delivered babies as they were disappeared. The women, some of the women gave birth in prison, right? Imagine what guts it takes to have a child in prison in those terrifying conditions. So there are children of the disappeared, right? So when I asked the children, by that time the children were in their 20s, early 20s, just the age that their father or mother was when they disappeared.
Who raised the children?
Grandparents. There's a lot of grandparents in the book, right?
So their parents remained disappeared, but
most of the disappeared fathers or mothers remained disappeared. But so, yeah, they were brought up by a number of caregivers, right? Some have mothers or fathers, and usually grandparents or a sibling of the disappeared. But when you ask the children of the disappeared, who also over generations made a group, and their motto is, we do not forget and we do not forgive. To this day, right? We do not forget and we do not forgive and we do not reconcile. Interesting, right? So when we talk about reconciliation, we have to really think about what we're doing. So when I asked them in their 20s, tell me what happened. Same story. They said, oh, no, nothing happened to me. That what happened was to my father or my mother or my uncle, or, right? So I had to grapple with these cultural specific ways in which people, I don't want to say they banalized the problem, because the whole society erased the problem. They dealt with the problem, but they didn't call it trauma. Here in the conference, we're trying to think about kind of very large-scale body of people suffer trauma. By now, maybe we want to put it in inverted commas, right? Historical trauma involves large masses of people who have, in a way, have a shared experience in their culture of some form of very massive political violence. War is usually war. Mind you, in Argentina, Uruguay, and a lot of Central American countries, it was dirty wars, or this sort of a somewhat invisibilized civil wars, right? Genocidal policies, whether they're all out, like in Guatemala, which was completely endemic, or ethnocide, which is could be, what we talk about, the Native Americans, assimilation, or, encouraging people not to transmit their own culture. So there's many ways of sharing some kind of human-made disasters, right? And of course, forms of endemic discrimination in different shapes also gets transmitted as historical or cultural trauma. The main issue is that this is not an individual thing, right? This is something where civil society as a whole is affected. Of course, it's obvious when it's destroyed, like the cases of, genocide or world wars or something like that. Sometimes you think that the so-called victims are those who are affected, and you think that the wider civil society is not affected. And that's one of the problems. Oh, it happened to them, it didn't happen to me. So then what happens there? Yeah? Do you see that is a distancing, a disconnection? It's your problem, but it's not my problem, right? That's where it starts. I mean, that could be a sign of cultural trauma. And of course, the other thing is, let me see if I have it here. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of items there, but I want to just go back to the idea of identity, right? What happens, identity and memory. What happens is you, as a person, don't even have to have experienced the event of trauma, right? Is that clear for you? I mean, I think that the speakers yesterday and today made very clear that you can be part of a people's, and as long as you're part of those peoples, that transmit a certain history, even if it's not the official history, you may be subject of cultural trauma. That doesn't mean you have to go around feeling like a victim, right? That is really a separate question. Is that recognizing that, yeah, the playing field is not level, that there are dynamics of power in the uses of resources, physical, psychological, spiritual, geographic, right, place. Who gets it right to be in a place, you know? And that involves you in a sort of way in this story of cultural trauma. And so it couches or it helps understand individual ways of expressing behavior, right? So what we're doing, I think mostly in American culture, we isolate the individual and we put all sorts of resources to the individual as if we have to do this remedial work because somehow they're faulty. So we're operating at this sort of, how do we call it, a model? Deficit model. I hate the word. So it's a deficit model, and we forget conveniently all of these things that we just talked about, right? That this is a result of a historical process. Historical, cultural, political, economic, right? So that's why the social silencing part is so important. And there's many things going on in the social silencing, right? Social silencing is obviously people and communities are overwhelmed, so they naturally tend to deny or try to forget or keep it in some compartment back in the background of your being, right? That's a psychological process we all go through, we can't avoid. But as cultures, there also are segments of the population that have an investment in not having those stories to broadcast or publish, right? So that's when I talk about oblivion in that way. The silencing may be very acceptable for a time. It may be part of the process of mourning the loss if you're able to mourn, right? If you're able to heal, there may be a time where you need that retreating into yourself. Asada today said, well, you go to your quarters and just take care of yourself, right? That's kind of, we all need that. Everybody's gone through some of this or you've witnessed it. If we've witnessed people going through this, we are sort of vicarious witnesses of trauma, right? You know that sometimes you need that silence. It's the dignity of those who've gone through the experience. So I'm not against silence. I'm just saying that the silencing forces in society, in the culture, that don't allow people to tell their stories, make them visible, so that society can own up to these dynamics and make the necessary steps towards, I don't know, whether you call it repair, you call it truth-telling, or you call it whatever you want, right? Why do the children of the disappeared say, we are not reconciling? What do you read when I say that? No olvidamos, no perdonamos, y no nos reconciliamos. What does that mean? Right. We are not forgetting, we are not forgiving, and we are not reconciling.
I think it's validation. What we were talking about, what Asada was talking about earlier. It's validation. Like it happened.
Right. Remember how we said the intersubjective things are mutual. We're not individuals that came out of a cabbage, right? We are individuals that are related to everyone all the time. There's a mutuality. When trauma happens, let me see what I have after. Oh, okay, yeah, no, that's one part. When trauma happens, it's almost that we lose that mutuality, right? And so how can we repair what was broken? Again, I said, if the weight is falling on the victim itself, in this case, it's the child of the victim who had to grow up without a father or a mother or a member of their family and carry that tremendous silence and difficult mourning in their communities, right? It's not for them to heal and repair and reconcile. That what they're saying is, I want the state, I want the society, I want these institutions to say something happened, right? These people were taken away illegally. It's called enforced disappearance. It's not, oh, they were missing. They didn't run off with their girlfriend to Brazil. They are, which was the version that, we children received. Oh, your uncle maybe just found a beautiful woman and went to the carnival in Brazil, and there they are, right? The state took them. The state needs to put the first step, right? Or the society as a whole has to recognize something happened. I'm sorry, you wanted to add something
I
back
think
there.
that in this case, the intersubjectivity shows itself in the cultural way of what happened, right? So there was a silencing of it, right?
Yes.
So the response to it is, it's not going to go away. It's not going to be
Mm-hmm.
silenced. And so, you know, it's interesting, as you were talking, like so many different lenses came up, and I thought from an American perspective, you might say there's a stuck point there, but actually I don't think it's a stuck point. I think it's just the opposite. It's a way of not forgetting, and with this other lovely lady was saying, it's a way of validation. It's saying we're not
Exactly.
going to let it go, and we want this. This is what we want.
Exactly. So both of you have already, highlighted what I wanted, which is there has to be a mutuality. There has to be a conversation. You can't be the victim and eat your cake too. You need the other to be there. You need the other to listen to your story. Actually listen, don't say, oh yeah, tell us a story, we'll put it in a nice report. It'll be in the archives, in the National Archives, that nobody knows what happened. And there's not an established lesson. Never again. This cannot happen. These were human beings that were simply 19, 20-year-olds trying to work towards a better society collectively, right? Yes.
I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for bringing this up because I feel like I'm having a strong reaction to this. I might have to step out. I didn't
All right, breathe.
I know. I remember saying you breathe. But
Breathe.
This is very personal to me. I was there. I was born under the coup, and I feel like I came out with a rebel spirit. But just to put it in a very personal perspective, when my mom brought us to this country, she stripped us of our identity, or tried to, and it made me rebel even more. She tried to say, no, you have to speak English, be Americana, don't forget about
Assimilation, right? Yeah.
very much assimilation.
Yeah.
And then even from other Latinos, it's like, oh, I didn't know you're Latina, oh, but you speak like a Valley girl, or you're not dark enough, or you don't have an accent. And I've never acknowledged that, or I have to just move on and say, no, I didn't suffer as much as other people, but individually.
All right, there it
It's one
is.
thing to suffer as a collective, but as individual, we still suffer and we still have our stories. And I'm still understanding her, because my uncle disappeared, and I
Wow.
still don't know the story. And it was like, well, he used to drink. Give a shit that he drank.
He must have done something.
He must have done something, right? And he died under the military dictatorship. So I wanted to add that
Well, thank you for
story.
sharing that. What's your name?
Marcela.
Thank you, Marcela. That really makes me almost cry because I would never expect to have a Uruguayan in the audience that actually has been there too. So it's very healing for me. I don't know about everyone else, but it's very nice to be able to. So you see what happens when there's an acknowledgement that something happened. Whatever your culture is, wherever you are, you could be in Little Montevideo or in DF, which is millions of people, right? It's the lack of recognition is as traumatizing probably as the actual horrifying deed. Yes?
What I'm trying to see is the telling of the stories are so powerful that it makes a connection. Even though from Uruguay, I'm from el Distrito Federal, there's a connection.
Thank you.
The more you become personal, the more you share the details of the wound, there's more connection. So
Right.
the illusion that we're separate in our traumas, because what I'm hearing is that one group is unique, this happened to us, and this is unique.
It's unique,
What
exactly.
happened to the colonized people is unique, what happened, and it's not unique, there's a shared hurt, and so what I'm interested in is if it's a collective wound, it has to be a collective healing.
Great, that could be our first, the first thing we write in our collective handbook, right? How do we do that though, right? So what you're doing right now, I mean, people coming forth and saying, wow, this touches me because this is my story. I think the first part could be, I mean, it involves the personal, right? Definitely you're healing a person that is in front of you. Not stop there because it's not a very healing if Marcela and me go off to the corner and talk about all our old traumas, but the Uruguayan government still erases the histories of all your uncle, right? And I have people, not in my blood family, but I have people that I know that have suffered this experience or the experience of torture, right? When you have been a subject of torture, you've survived. You are there. We have including that president that I mentioned. Pepe Mujica was a victim of torture and became president, right? So people are not dragging themselves on the floor. They are doing full things with their lives, but they carry that story. I think that what you say is perfect because it is culturally specific and each person have their story to tell, and it is going to be unique. If we have time to share even any story that you can think of that is inspiring to you, painful but inspiring, you will see that the beauty is in what you just said, is in the detail. When the people open up and tell the story, whether they're African American or Native American or Rwandan or Sudanese or Syrian or Uruguayan, we're not going to care, how many colors. I mean, actually, Asada was beautiful. I love her outfit with all the colors. I did the opposite. I wore black, right? But once the story is shared, and that's what you just said, resonates from one culture or one community to another, that's when that mutuality starts happening again. The intersubjectivity is somewhat repaired by the reconnection. So we do need to reconnect individually, but we have to be able to somehow find the connections communally, right? Now the question, how do we do that? I have some suggestions later, but yeah?
I just wanted to comment on that. You mentioned why the defense mechanism was to be silent. This is not going to be discussed. In immigration, I'm an immigrant. And that's a traumatic experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it's an experience of being uprooted. And I had no choice. It was 5 years of age I came to this country. And I was uprooted. And I had no say in that. But we do not talk about it. Not only my family.
Very interesting.
Other immigrant families that I work with, nobody talks about the immigration. The parents do not discuss with their children, the next generation, what they went through. They're heroes.
I agree with you. I send my students to interview their grandparents and their parents to recover their family legacy, right? Which, by the way, is something that eco-parenting has done beautifully. They have these exercises that they work on with family legacies, right? Because that reconnects you. When we say reconnecting, right, it's not just with your neighbor or your community. It may be reconnecting with your past generations, right? So that you can understand more why people do whatever they do, right? You don't necessarily have to excuse what they did if there was some family violence or communal, tensions involved, but you might start to understand where people are coming from if they're angry or they're silent or they retreat into their own or whatever they're doing with their legacy of their charged emotions, right? But if you don't, well, first, breathe in a way that allows you some room to grow, right, yourself. The symbol we always use about the oxygen mask, right? And if you're not breathing, you cannot reach out to touch somebody else and say, I'm here, you can tell me. Or I'm here, I need you to listen to me, right? What happened in Uruguayan society, and I agree with you that in a lot of the immigrant stories, wherever you may be, is that societies that receive you, they do not listen to the story. They don't want to, for many reasons, or they don't have that capacity, and culturally that's not fostered, right? Maybe the curiosity is not fostered. Maybe the idea, there's a lot of ideological reasons why not, right? But again, I have these just because in case people are still thinking of trauma as 10. Oh, good, 20, good, perfect. So, of course, we all know 9/11, which is to me is like the closest global trauma kind of event that we have. It's a discrete event, happened to a number of buildings. Well, it's happened in several cities, but we all have this image of Twin Towers burning. And I apologize for bringing back to you these awful images, right? But to connect to American audiences is effective. Before the 9/11 Twin Towers tragedy, I was finishing my work after about 80 years of talking to different people and mothers and children who disappeared, communities of exiles, communities of people who had gone through the prison experience. And I was coming back to New York. It was September 10, 2001. And as you know, if you have images of Madres de Plaza de Mayo, which you won't have images of Madres de Plaza Libertad in Montevideo, right? Only Marcela and me probably know what Plaza Libertad looks like. But Plaza de Mayo, right, is women would put the foulards and walk around with the pictures of their disappeared, right? Whether they're like banners, or in El Salvador, sometimes the mothers put the pictures with a pin here, or, the relatives all around the world. In Philippines, I mean, it's not just privy to Latin America. Relatives have pictures of their loved ones that they kind of carousel around to show communities and governments that they must respond, right? For me, it was incredibly painful to get to New York, and the next day, I see Americans with pictures of their loved ones pinned in, looking for them, after the Twin Towers, right? So it sounds like it was only after 2001, right? Sorry, 2008. So that 2001 was when somehow trauma became more global in terms of, not that it wasn't happening already all around the world, right? But it became something that goes across cultures through the media, right? Just want to remember that. But imagine if most cultures in the world have had the Twin Towers tragedy happening again and again and again and again, year after year, just like that Native American Sioux woman said in the documentary, right? It's a wound that it doesn't heal because it's ongoing, right? So it's unimaginable, right? The kinds of trauma, historically, that cultures have gone through. But again, the speaking of uniqueness separates us. And I'm not trying to erase the differences. I have Jewish legacy in my past as well, right? That's how a lot of people got to Uruguay, with a mix of people migrating for different wars and different reasons, right? Because the indigenous people of the land were wiped out by genocide. So we have a combination in the southern cone of Latin America of genocide, colonialization, and waves of migration, right? So, I mean, what culture is free of migration other than if you were First Peoples and you also were subject to genocide? So it is sort of mind-boggling. It almost turns trauma into a word that is no longer meaningful, right? Again, unless you go back to the subject and their community and their intersubjectivity, what meaning does this experience have for the person, right? A lot of times, as I said, you don't have to be the bearer of the experience to be affected by it. A lot of people may bear this without even knowing, right? So when you finally reconnect, and could be, I'm thinking of Marcela, that could be what is moving you, that if you start connecting to your culture and your language and your ancestry, there is some pain there. But I would also argue that there is some strength in it. Reconnecting to your roots, however chopped they were, and I identify with that, may give you some valuable, culturally specific lessons, right? That makes you who you are. So that's why I'm going back to identity and memory, right? Effects. This is 2 slides that I want to go really quickly because I want to get to something that I want you to take with you, to think about and to respond. We might not have time to respond, all of us, but maybe even if 2 or 3 of you can respond to a few questions I have in a couple slides, we will go home with some specific ideas. So this just, actually this summarizes what we just said. So I'm going to keep going. So the problem with trauma in terms of collective or cultural, collective would be more of a present, what's happening in the community. Cultural trauma would be something that endures through time across generations. So that would be kind of what I would say to define the different thing. So we can think about collective trauma as this idea of the elephant in the room. We kind of all know it's there, but we all act as if it's not there, right? That's one of the things. So we exclude these stories, we exclude the signs, or we don't see the signs that are in plain sight. So this has a potential, right, to affect memory and how we tell the story. If we're avoiding what's central in the story, right, and we're not including what was excluded. That's why typically cultures that are trying to reclaim their past, they fight against the official history, right? Well, we talk about her story or the native story, or whether Columbus was a good guy or a bad guy, right? Or, we in Uruguay learned that Rivera, our first president, was such a good guy. He was the one responsible for the genocide of the indigenous people, but so what? That doesn't get taught in the first grade in school, right? So sometimes reclaiming this idea of cultural, historical past, difficult past, let's call it, if you don't want to call it trauma, involves confronting these official versions that are not the versions that are going to help us heal or find the genuine. In a way, do we still believe in the genuine story? What do genuine transmission of stories do to our identities, as opposed to transmitting official versions that are really not that, I don't know, how do you call it? They are not, they're not whole, they're not, they are sort of, well, I don't want to use the word fake. They're not grounded in historical experience, right? How about that? So what signs? This is just my own attempt at trying to give you some indices. How do we find out about these things? There's a couple of slides, and then I have questions for you that you can take with you. And if we have 5 minutes, maybe we'll have time. And so as I move through the next 2 slides, think of verbs of things we can do that help. You know, it'll be a little more eloquent there. But so usually the only thing you see is fragmentation, fragmented experiences. So narratives that are not really there. I mean, so we all catch glimpses of what our ancestors said, but we don't have a full story. So we know somebody migrated, for example, to take your example, but we don't really know what happened to our grandparents or great-grandparents, how they did it, who was it that pushed them out, right? And if we find the stories, it usually transforms our understanding of our own histories. And if it's someone else that we're helping with this, it transforms their vision. Because again, there's this mutuality that gets transformed. And you see yourself differently, and others see yourself differently when these stories become more whole, right? So you go from something that is unknowable and unsayable, kind of taboo, and all families have secrets, so this connects in the personal. If you're a family therapist here, you know this idea of secrecy. Secrets really leave ghosts and haunt people for generations. That's the fastest way I can say it. So if you can start making stories more whole, thank you for that word, whoever shouted out there, that may help. Of course, the distrust is another sign. We saw it clearly today in La Casa Libre, right? To invite people over to your own home, nobody's just going to just go, right? They need a reason to trust you. And when you've suffered through this fragmentation of society, which is what caused the trauma in the first place, it's very hard to trust. So I know Marcela went through a lot of barriers to share that with us, because I know in Uruguay this is not the common thing that we can do, right? Talk about our stories. There's distancing, there's distrust, and then of course you've taken the first step if you're started to look for the meaning of the event. One of the problems with trauma or the aftermath of trauma is that it has no meaning. Why me? Why did it happen? There is no answer, right? You have to look for the meaning that makes sense in your legacy, right? And that's where the beauty of the detail is. You could be writing if you want, or imagining or making a vision of what is the meaning of whatever you've been exposed to for you, right? I have my own meaning of my displacement, right? And there's several versions. So sometimes working, even if it's in a dyad or in a family or in a couple or in a community or in a large audience, going back to what people make of their own meaning of the experience. I think that, to me, would be the first, not the first step, because to get there you have to do some things before that, but it would start looking like healing. If you have find some meaning or the putting together the story in a less fragmented way, people can start thinking about meaning. In my book, there's a lot of parents, caregivers, they're not always mothers or fathers, and children. And the problem in the culture in Uruguay is that because the state didn't want to recognize it, and because it took decades for it to even become part of the dialogue, public dialogue, now it is taught at schools in a kind of rather fragmented way. We still don't have a meaning. We still don't know why things happen and how they unfolded. We still don't have a clear lesson that this can never happen again, right? So then we are still looking for the meaning. That means to me that this cultural trauma is not healed yet at all, because we can't tell in the families themselves that are the people who have brought this matter to the public discussion, the children, it's lovely to see how the children try to articulate these stories. The children know that something dreadful happened. They always know. There's no sparing them, right? All the families that were very silent because, no, we don't want to harm the children. You know what the children do? That's my favorite part of the book. I call that the sort of like investigative techniques. You know, they go and they rummage through drawers and they look behind furniture and they find the banners and they find the pictures and they find all kinds of things that you are, as an adult, are hiding from them. It sounds like it's easier to give the story, however, at whatever level. You know, if you have to come down here and tell a story that a child can understand, that's all right. You don't want to overwhelm the child with gruesome details, right? But you don't want to leave the child without a story because the children know much more than we think, right? So again, it goes to naming that something has happened, as simple as that, right? But in order to name that something has happened, right? And there I have some of the other things that people tell me that that's how they see that something happened, right? There are lessons. Families, communities, cultures hand down lessons. I mean, my jaw dropped when I heard the two speakers that talked about the African American community yesterday and today, what the lessons are for American culture, right? The lessons are absolutely devastating, right? I mean, we need to change those lessons, right? In terms of black children, or, you know, I can relate a little bit because I think that the Latino community may have some of those for different historical reasons, but there are also some not very healing lessons passed down through the generations. So when we talk about lessons, we're not talking about good or bad. They can be very constructive and healing, or they can be nasty, right? So let's think, what lessons, in a way, Asade said it, what lessons did we get from our elders? But what lessons are we transmitting to our youth, whether they're children or just students or people that we relate to, befriend, or mentor? Right? Most communities that have a clear picture of that what they went through, they always have a sense of duty. It's usually a pending duty because no culture that I know has closed their accounts on trauma, right? Even the Argentinians and the South Africans, which are the stellar cases where people talked endlessly about their stories and we think that they healed. No, they're not healed. And I know about both cases. So even in the cases where there was some justice and some truth-telling communally, there's tons of things to still work on, right? So again, you don't have to be a direct witness to experience trauma. You can be secondary witness. You can be vicarious witness. But what's important is to notice at the level of families, well, relationships, of course, relations. When I say trauma is intersubjective, we're talking about relationships, all kinds of relationships, from a diet and onward, right? So this is where we wanted to get to, and now we're almost out of time, right? But this is what I want you to remember. Trauma is not a bad gene. It's not biological. It's no neurological. I mean, despite, I know that we train people in the biology and neurology of trauma because it is important. It does have effects, especially for children, and children might regulate less. All that is true. But that still doesn't mean that when you suffer trauma, it's going to pass down as a bad gene and you're doomed. You know, we're not fated to trauma. We're actually engineered to be very resilient and to grow. Otherwise, you know, the world would not be overpopulated. We will all be jumping off bridges left and right, right? We are very resilient. That breaking the silence, no matter how silent and how thick the silence is possible. Because as I said, if people in Uruguay were able to break the silence 25 or 30 years later, then anybody can. Even if it takes a while. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of obstinate patience, what a Chilean filmmaker called it, the obstinate memory. Changing trauma's legacy. You can change. I mean, that's the opposite of the first line, right? Trauma's legacy is not inevitable. That's where the social sciences come in, right? You can reverse and learn different lessons. It's a pedagogic problem, right? How do you transmit and change paradigms? I guess in the way Asada did beautifully today, saying, oh, I'm not going to talk about trauma, the T word. And I love the way she kind of gave it a lot of passion, right? So how can we learn This is something I was going to show you that I'm going to have to skip. Here it is. Let me leave you with some questions that are the ones that, well, this is a couple of ideas and then comes the question, right? So what can we do? This is just my own distilling what I learned from my research and my own experience and what these people suffering from state terrorism for decades told me, right? One is that you have to develop. It is something that you help or develop in yourself and then help others develop. So it's, again, it's intersubjective, it's collective, it's mutual. You have to get to an inner sense of security, even in the midst of violent times. I was working with people that were going through corridors and meeting each other at a time where even having a meeting of two people was considered to be subversive. You would be called a terrorist if you meet with another person, right? Trust is the first thing that breaks. If you don't believe me, notice what's happening in American society right now, which is, to me, a little bit of an alert signal. Mourning is the first thing that gets affected as well. The ability to mourn a loss when the loss is ongoing and there is no response to it is very difficult, right? So being able to help, if it's an individual and therapeutic level, helping the person to mourn is a good step towards healing, right? Because otherwise the trauma gets kind of like a cyst, right? It just stays there. It doesn't move. You need to help it move. Some people need someone else to see that they have difficult mourning. Kind of like Luisa that I talked about before. Her nephew came and said, Luisa, your son is dead. They killed him. You have to move on from this. She said, nope, I'm not going to move on from this. I'm going to keep going, looking for him until the last day, until the state tells me what they did with him. So this difficult mourning has a good reason, right? Psychologically, she could not mourn. She hasn't mourned today. She's 98. And this happened 40 years ago, right? But most of the time, you have to find a way to work through this and somehow move towards the present, right? I'm going to skip that. So basically, you need to be able to become present or help the people you're working with to become present. What happened to you was then, this is now. In the present, there are X resources, there are healing possibilities, there are creative possibilities. If you're not in your present, it will be very hard to be creative with your possibilities, right? So this is the questions I had. I don't know, do we have a minute or are we done? Okay, we have 2 minutes, maybe 3, for some of you to come forward and maybe comment on one of these. I was going to do a pair work, and we obviously didn't calculate the time that great. But this unfreezing from the past to the present, from the isolation of the individual to being able to share. What does it look like to you? And it, of course, doesn't have to be about your own experience. It could be about someone you know that inspires you. Thank you.
I just want to share that, it's really brave to share these stories, and a lot of people don't want to share because they feel a lot of shame and guilt because of what happened to them or to their people. And so what I've been using when I present this to clients or in storytelling workshops is also doing magical realism and using archetypes or other types of maybe fictional characters or legends in our history or in our cultures so it won't really be about yourself, but you're able to get it out anyway.
That's brilliant.
So what I do, especially with moms that are experiencing perinatal depression, is using La Llorona story and like using her story so they could express whatever happened to them during that period of perinatal depression or postpartum depression.
Right. Thank you for that. That's actually wonderful. What some of these groups have used is asking what their dreams are about. Because the ability to dream also kind of is impaired if you're kind of stuck in your past, right? So when they can't dream, then we ask people talk about any revenge fantasies as a fantasy. So people can sort of get out the anger and the frustration. And actually, one of the interesting things in Uruguay is there's never been an aggression from a victim of state terrorism to a perpetrator. And I told you, they live together. They know their houses. They know where they are, right? But the anger is internalized, right? So using some myths or some stories and some vehicles to elaborate on a different character and being able to let out those fantasies is great. So revenge fantasies and rescue fantasies. A lot of times people who have gone through these things, they kind of have in their head rescue fantasies. And then, of course, the other thing is, tell me about the future. Tell me about the future you want. And that could also bring... So anyways, do we have a couple more people that want to share a verb or something that... Yes, thank you.
I think it could be helpful for how saying, like, sharing someone else's story that's similar to theirs, when people feel the connection that hearing that story made them feel, that pointing out to them that how that was helpful to them, so that they can feel like when they get to the point that they can share their story, that how helpful that can be to someone else,
right.
Because then it empowers them to help someone else. That I think, it gives them a power over the situation.
Right. That makes sense, and that's very sort of mutual, right? Yeah.
And I have a question, because you spoke about historical trauma in, context of displacement, genocide, and there's certain things like that, but something that keeps popping in my head, or like a different example would be like a child who's a product of rape. Is that collective trauma that becomes historical, because, I don't know anyone who's like that, but I can just think of them and how they may feel that disconnect, that anger, that loss of, self-identity. How would you deal with that?
Absolutely. That's a great example. I don't know if I deal with it any different because, we don't know what the circumstances of that gender violence that led to this, right? But obviously, there has to be a lot of structural violence and also gender relations that are not right. So telling that story could be really difficult, right? So that might be more of a dyadic work with a therapist or an educator, but at some point could open to the communities. How much violence against women is there in our region, in Latin America? Women are dying as we speak of gender violence, right? So I don't think it's only your story is important, but I don't think it's individual either, right? There could be a lot of... I think I'm out of time, so I don't know. Do we have one last person to raise a question?
What I'm thinking is, for those that feel ready to head out and transition,
yes.
That there's no disrespect if you're ready to leave, and for those that want to linger.
Maybe we can take 5 more minutes, but feel free to leave. I thank you all for coming. Stay with me if you want for...